Hi, today we're talking about some of the different types of tubeless systems and how to install them. The first step to a proper tubeless setup, after we've determined that the rim strip is installed and everything looks up to snuff, is that we're going to install the valve stem. The valve stem will drop through and then be held in place by its lock ring. We'll tighten that down just by hand enough to where it's firm in place but not deforming the rubber. The next step is going to be determining orientation on your tire. The worst thing you could do with any tubeless setup is install it backwards and then have to redo it. The tire rotates this way. We'll orient the rim so that it has the same rotating direction and install one bead at a time. If you find that the bead is harder to install than on your old setup, don't be surprised. Like we mentioned before, tubeless setups are supposed to have very, very tight bead to rim interfaces. What we will do next is make sure that the bead is clearing the valve stem. You'll just put it on the other side and push the tire into place. If the tire is too tight in terms of the installation, you can use tire levers to install it, unlike with a tubed system. With a tube system, if you use tire levers to install the system, you may pop the tube. Since there's no tube in a tubeless system, we're okay to do it. You'll use the tire lever opposite of how you would to pull off the tire. You'll flip it around and hook the rim and pull the tire into place. It may be very, very tight. The tire bead is now installed on both sides. Our next step is to remove the valve stem using a Presta valve stem remover tool. And also, we're going to use a sealant injector tool to put in 6 ounces of pre-measured sealant into the tire. We'll unscrew the valve stem till it drops out. Make sure you put it on the bench in a place that you won't lose. Grab your sealant injector and insert it onto the end of the valve. The reason why you use a Presta valve remover tool is because otherwise you will not be able to inject the sealant into the tire. We will then insert the tubeless sealant, push a little air in, and then take the injector tool off and reinstall the valve. You will just hand tighten the valve. Don't over torque it, as you can strip it. The next step is to inflate the tubeless tire. It's much harder to inflate it using a hand pump than a compressor. Today we're going to be using a compressor. Double check on the bead of your tubeless tire. When you inflate it for the first time, you should be looking for sealant leaking out. Something you can do while it's relatively low pressure is the bounce test. Bouncing it's going to distribute sealant up to the bead of the tire and the rim interface and help it seal more effectively. It also gives you an opportunity to look over the bead after doing that to make sure that there isn't sealant leaking out of it. This is looking great. The only things that I'm seeing so far is that the bead hasn't completely set from here to here. That means we need to add more pressure into the system to get the bead to sit where it needs to. It's just over 20 psi, So we'll bump it up to 40 and see if that fixes it. You may have been able to hear slight popping. That's the bead setting itself into place. At 40 psi, it's already started migrating. Something that we can do to help it is by grabbing the sidewall and kind of pulling on it. That puts pressure on the tire and pulls it into place. This is looking good, but we still do need to add a little bit of pressure. We're going to take it up to 60 psi next. That large crackling was the bead finally setting itself in the rim. There's good bead interface on both sides of the tire. With a tubeless tire, it's important to keep it aired up in between rides. If you don't air it up in between rides, what can happen is that the seal between the rim and the tire will be lost because pressure is the only thing holding it in besides the sealant. It's important to keep the tires aired up to around 40 psi in between rides and lower it to whatever you prefer while riding. As we mentioned before, tubeless tires are able to run a lower pressure than a tube tire. Generally, people find themselves running up to 5 psi less. Today you've seen a mountain tubeless setup. As we've talked about, there are different setups with different requirements. If you need help with anything, please contact customer service. And if you found this video helpful, please subscribe to our channel and share with your friends.